So we just had a bit of a technical issue there. I'm joined by my former professor, Nathan Scoggins. He taught me many things about filmmaking, storytelling, all of the above at John Paul the Great Catholic University in San Diego. And I've since gone on and moved to Nashville. I did some production work in LA, and Nathan is still very much a part of the space. There's many things I could say about my former professor, but I'd prefer to have him kind of lead the charge. But I do want to start, Nathan, with two questions. The first being that a lot of film students come into the program thinking that they're going to be a director or they're going to be a writer. How does one go about determining if that is in fact the case? And what was that moment of realization for you as now both a writer and a director of several projects?
Sure. So you may have noticed, a face like blipping past there, and it's my daughter. It's one of three that I have with my wife. We've been married for 23 years, and
Congratulations.
thank you. And having my kids, having my wife, it's a reminder to me that we're never always one thing. I think a lot of times film students, they get very consumed by thinking of themselves as I'm this particular thing. And I think that one of the first things for all of us to remember always is that we are always more than one thing. And that actually my struggle as an artist, because a lot of times as artists, we suffer from this need for external validation. I make this thing, or I do this thing, or someone reads this thing, and as a result, I become validated in my identity. And I think that all of us as artists are looking for that a validation. Even just today, I had a meeting in a studio where I've recently sold a project, and the first thing that I was asked was, "Do you need validation?" And I kind of joked and said, "Yes. Could you tell me how wonderful I am?" And I think that is a reality of things. And of course, he was talking about parking validation. But I think that all of us are trying to figure out, who are we? And I do think that sometimes as artists, we feel like I've got to make something to prove who I am. And the reality is that that's not true. We are more than this. And sometimes we need those outside things, those things that we might see as distractions, to actually help remind us of who we are. I remember a friend of mine, her dad was a poet, and he would write these poems. I would sometimes find them in his notebook that he would leave around the house, and he would frequently refer to his family coming in as a distraction. Here they come again, buzzing bees that pull me away from whatever. And I actually find that the things that have nothing to do with my quote unquote work actually become crucial for me to just kind of keep my feet on the ground, so to speak, remind me what my true north is. So that's one of the first things that I always sort of remind film students when they come in, or when they come and talk to me, or when they want advice or whatever. It's like, okay, well, what else in your life brings you joy besides just this? So I think, so just to kind of frame it at that level. But I do think that you're always trying to figure out, it's funny, right? And I don't know where or if we'll talk about the spirituality of things, but sometimes, certainly John Paul the Great Catholic University, which, as people might infer, is a Catholic university. A lot of students will say, I'm called to be a writer, or I'm called to be a director, I'm called to be a producer. And it's funny, I've never heard somebody say, I'm called to be a gaffer. I'm called to be a best boy. And so I think that sometimes we spiritualize, or we put important value on certain jobs, when the reality is that, Aaron, both you and I know that sometimes the most important people on a set are the PAs, because they're the ones who are going to get you to make your day or not. And so I think that sometimes people sort of put these external pressures of who's got the most power, who's got the most influence, who's the most important on the set. That's what I want to do. And so I do think that sometimes, you do wind up in a situation where writers, producers, directors, everyone wants to be that, when the reality is that, look, if you're a DP, if you're craft services, you have a significant role to play on set. And so, I think that one of the challenges for all filmmakers is trying to figure out, where do I fit into the ecosystem of a set? And one of the things that I talk about with my film students is, where can you add the most value? What is your strongest value proposition? And you might think that you're a director, but it might actually be that you're a producer. that your leadership skills may not be in setting a shot and framing it and whatever. It may be in the logistics of organizing the show and in budgeting and scheduling, just making everything work efficiently. And so I do think that it is hard. But I do think that one of the things that all filmmakers and all film students have to do, especially these days, good grief, where it's so competitive, is what's the strongest value proposition you can make. In that, if you're a writer, fantastic. That's great. You've got a script. However, if you don't have a good producer to budget, organize it, schedule it, make it go, you're going to be stuck. If you don't have a director that can design the shots and make it work, you need all that stuff. So I think that more than ever, I'm trying to encourage students, cultivate your skills in more than one area, because you might think you're this, but actually you might be this. And I think if we have more than one skill set, it might help you figure out what you are versus what you aren't. But it also may, if you're able to master more than one skill set, it helps you be more valuable to a production. But you can really only do that by figuring it out. And so this is where when I first got brought in to teach at JP Catholic, and they said, what would you do with the students? And I said, put cameras in their hands as quickly as possible. Get them making stuff, because I think it's the making stuff that tells you who you are. And I think that if you think you're a director, start shooting, because you'll learn very quickly whether you are or you're not. If you think you're a DP, start shooting. Like if you're a writer, start trying to find ways to get your work out there. Like make stuff. And one of the things that I always tell the students is your rule should be either I'm making stuff or I'm watching stuff. Because if we are not being inspired by watching movies and shows that can excite us creatively, we're going to struggle. And then an artist can't create out of an empty vessel. But then also be making stuff. Embrace that artistic discipline that comes with shooting stuff all the time. So I think that's, I think those are things to think about. But then also for me, I started out, I directed plays all through high school. And so I knew that I had leadership skills, and I'd always been a leader in different capacities, whether it was at school or at church or different places. And so I do think that especially if you're a director or a producer, you need a degree of leadership in that, do people follow you? Do people kind of go when you say it's time, right? And there are people for whom that does not happen. And then there are people for whom that does. And for me, I just realized that something would happen when I would say go, or people would go. But I still needed to learn cinematic language, learn cinematic whatever. So the first several projects that I made in LA, I started out as a writer and a producer, because set life is very different. And so I needed to learn the rhythms of set life, learn the procedures of set life, learn how to operate on a set. And so I was very fortunate that the first couple of projects that I wrote as short films, I got to shadow on set. I got to shadow, see, there goes my wife. I got to shadow directors and kind of watch things and learn how things went. And that was how I was able to kind of figure out, okay, I think I've got more here than just being a writer, not just in a pejorative sense, but I was able to add more than just the value of being a writer, which is not insignificant. But along the way, learning how to produce, learning how to budget, learning how to schedule, learning how to organize, all these things actually have helped me become a better director, because I had to learn how to think about a day efficiently, right? When you're directing, you have to think about how you're going to make your day. It forces you to work in a different way. So I do think that the producing stuff that I learned along the way helped me get better as a filmmaker. So again, I really encourage young filmmakers, learn everything you can, so you can start to figure out where you fit in and where your particular skills are going to match the needs of the production.
Yeah, no, 100%. I would suggest the same. For what it's worth, I had a television director on previously on this podcast, Fred Toy, who just
I heard
won an Emmy for Shogun, which is super nice for him. But one of the subjects that we had touched on there was kind of, I guess, the part two to this initial conversation, which is being seen as a creative. Because I think that's the other piece of it, is like sort of the self realization, okay, I have something to offer this. And then also kind of making it known in a way that other people trust, like your creative instincts. That's another thing that I would love to ask you, uh, as someone who has had a very hands-on creative role in a lot of the projects that you've done, writing and directing. How do you get seen as a creative? How do you go from being a producer to somebody whose creative voice is trusted?
Well, I think I think it starts with how you see yourself. Do you see yourself as somebody who has something to say, right? There's that line from A Star Is Born. Everybody's got a voice, not everybody has something to say. And so I do think that you have to see yourself that way. And I think that film is one of the unique industries where, generally speaking, if you introduce yourself a certain way, people go, okay. They kind of take you at face value. But sooner or later, it becomes this thing of like, well, are you doing what you said you're going to do, right? One of my friends and mentors, Ralph Winter, says that being a producer is very simple. It's just doing what you say you're going to do. And so, if you say you're a writer, okay, are you writing? Do you have stuff that you've written, right? I remember going to my first Hollywood party. I hadn't even moved to LA yet, but I got into this party, and I was talking with this woman who introduced herself to me as a writer. And I said, "Oh, okay. What have you written?" And she said, "Well, I've written a script." And I said, "Okay. How long have you been out here?" She said, "5 years." And I went, "Oh." And she said, "I go to the beach a lot." And the reality is that I think that if you see yourself a certain way, then you have to start living up to that responsibility, right? But I do think that it does start with how you see yourself. Are you giving yourself permission to be an artist? And then are you doing the things that an artist needs to be? I mean, the reality is that because I did start out as a writer, I have the ability to create work for myself. A lot of times as a director, you're waiting for other people to bring you something. Whereas as a writer director, I can create opportunities for myself. And that's where, I've been very generative over the years because I do have stuff. But it has also meant that when I'm brought into a project as a producer, people know that they're getting my organizational skills, but also they're getting my storytelling skills. And those storytelling skills can be very valuable. So I do think that it does come down to the rubber meets the road in terms of, are you doing it? And look, none of us can do it every day, all the time. So there is that. I don't think we're all of us 24/7 artists, but I do think that certainly as a writer, I have a responsibility to be generating material. And so this year has been a very interesting year because I sold a pitch in March. I sold a pitch in May. I'm in talks about another project now. I picked up a very quick rewrite gig about a month ago that I turned around in 2 weeks. I just delivered a pilot to my producing partner on Friday, and he gave me some notes, and I delivered a quick polish this morning. Like, I'm just always creating. And so I think that's one of the things is if you want to be seen in a particular way, you got to have the stuff. And the stuff is just having the material, having the ability to do it. If you're presenting yourself as a producer and somebody says, "I'm looking for a producer," okay, what skills do you have as a producer? Can you demonstrate it? If they give you a budget if they give you a project on a Friday, a week later, can you have it broken down? Can you have it? Do you have an additional budget that you can put together for it? Do you have a schedule, right? Like, can you actually do it? Right now, I'm at a point as a director where I've got a reel of my work. So when people say, what have you done? I can show you the TV stuff I've done. I can show you the commercial stuff that I've done. I can show you the film stuff that I've done. I can show you the PSAs and the commercials that I've done. And that's all on my website. So people can see it, and so people can know that you can do it. Because I think that if you can't demonstrate that you've done it, it becomes very hard for people to believe that you can do it. But if you can demonstrate that you've done it, if you have samples of your work, all this kind of stuff, Wednesday, a very good friend of mine called me and said, "Hey, I want to put you up for a gig. Can you send me some stuff?" And I had some stuff to send them, and it demonstrates that I can do it. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does, definitely. And there definitely seems to be an element of both timing with a lot of this, a lot of those opportunities. and being the right person at the right time. But also, I think maybe one of the things that I felt I had to retrain um, upon like working under somebody in development was just this idea that like it's always going to happen to everyone the same way. Like you're going to get that moment and it's going to be very obvious. I think it's
Yeah.
oftentimes very subtle, and it looks like building a long-term relationship with someone, and just being open in a general sense to whatever moment presents itself to show that you can be creative. In the case of Fred, he was a title credit editor on Alias, and then he got bumped up to being an editor under JJ, and said he spoke his truth that he was going to be a director, and they kind of went, okay, sure, dude. And like 3 months later, he was directing episodes for the show, which is pretty remarkable. And I think it speaks to sort of the spontaneity of opportunity in the industry. But I want to
Well,
talk about the
but I
first.
think that
Oh,
also, I think that also speaks to the power of proximity, right? Like
yes.
if you are in the kind of, I mean, Hollywood is one of these weird businesses where I remember my old film professor said this, Janine Basinger. She said, Hollywood is a place where they hire you because they just happen to be thinking about you. And they happen
Mm,
to think about you because you were just in the room. And I think that there's a lot of people in LA who kind of, sit in their homes and are dreaming about stuff as opposed to kind of getting out there and doing and being. And this can be a scary thing, especially for writers who maybe are not necessarily the most social of creatures. But the reality is, it's like if no one knows who you are, no one can call you. I remember a couple, like 9 or 10 years ago, talking with somebody in her garage, and she said, "Oh, you know how this business goes. Like people can call you at any time." And I went, "Well, who are you waiting to call you?" And she had no real answer for that. Um, and that's not to knock this particular person or anything. It's just the reality is that if you're not out there, if you're not in relationship with people, if you're not checking in with people, if you're not following up with people, if you're not reaching out to people, it can be very difficult for people to think of you, right? In the case of Fred, it's like, well, when you're in the room with JJ and you're in the room with these people, it becomes much easier for them to think of you. And so are you putting yourself in positions where people can think of you in a particular way? And this is where, I get the dangers of being extremely online, but I do think that there is value in are you putting yourself in positions where people can see you, people can know you? And that speaks to, I think, the relational part of your business, of our business that you were talking to about earlier. Like this particular executive who called me in and to whom I sold this pitch in March. We've been friends for 20 years. And every 6 months or so, just kind of check in. We have a quick lunch in Burbank, whatever it is. And then suddenly the opportunity presented itself, but it was an opportunity that came from proximity, and the proximity came from just being in relationship with each other, right? And so this is a very relational business, and the more relationships you build, the more you create that opportunity where someone will think of you, or someone will give you a shot or give you an opportunity because they see you working hard, they know you, they trust you, and they have a level of comfort with you where they go, okay, I feel like you get it.
yeah, no, definitely. And there's sort of a shared reputation as well, right? When somebody gives you that opportunity, I think the trust kind of it goes along with that understanding that like they're staking some credibility on you.
For sure.
So there has to be some level of personal alignment with that person. At a minimum, just to know that you're a decent person. Oftentimes that simply will go a long way. It seems, but
More than ever, I think, because look, this is something that I try to teach the film students that I mentor teaches, though, is always we is better than me. And I think that Dan Lin talked about this in a podcast interview where he was talking about the creative process for the Lego movie. And it was Phil Lord and Chris Miller, and they came in. I think they've been fired twice already off of the film, and they came in like 6 weeks before they were supposed to start, and they just kind of blew up the script. But they had all the department heads come in together, and they worked together. And Phil Lord and Chris Miller had this idea that the director is not the source of all creativity. The director is the funnel through which creativity passes. And the more that everyone can feel like they're involved in the creative process, as opposed to sort of serving the director's vision, the stronger the project can be. Now, of course, sure, that's not going to happen in all cases, but I do think it speaks to your point, Aaron, that it's like, look, if we're going to bring people in, we want people who are going to be collaborative, who are going to be team centric, who are going to not be focused on my own ego, my own whatever, but are trying to be in service to the story, right? Even James Cameron talks in interviews about Avatar that he believes that Avatar is a real place, and so he's not trying to sort of create this thing. He's inviting his whole team of collaborators. He's inviting them to see the world, because he's trying to tell the world of Pandora. And I do think that the more that we try to stop making it about ourselves and more about the material, the project, the story, whatever it is, it does force you to die to your ego, I think, in an interesting way. But it also creates opportunity for that collaborative spirit that you're talking about, because you're absolutely right. If someone's going to stake their reputation to me, I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about, I can do a good job for you of telling this particular story.
Yeah. Well, I want to switch gears and talk about the first feature that you wrote and directed, the least of these. First, I guess.
Trial by fire, being 29 and
Right. The expectation of a young Nathan Scoggins versus the reality of the production. How did all of those pieces sort of initially align? And how was that experience? Some takeaways from it.
So it aligned because I had spent the last 2 to 3 years making short films every 6 months, fairly significant short films where you were dealing with budgets of 80,000, 10,000, 15,000, whatever it was, which was significant back in 2005, 2006, whatever it was. And I think that I had, this is a town where reputation rises, and because it is so hard to make stuff, if you're somebody who is always making stuff, people start to hear about you. And two of my short films had gotten released on DVD by Lionsgate. And through a sort of convergence of factors that's too long to get into here, I found myself being presented with the opportunities to find some financiers, to people who had some money. I had this script that could be done for a reasonable price, and then I had Isaiah Washington and Ralph Winter and these folks, my close friend then and to this day, Jimmy Duke. We all kind of came around each other and made this film. And I was 29 and had no idea what to expect, and thought that I knew what to expect, and then realized,
Did you come into it confident, or were you kind of like that I could totally screw this up?
I think you always have to.
You got to own it.
You kind of got to show up. People have a hard time if you show up on the set scared. So you kind of have to project confidence, and there's a difference in confidence and cockiness, right? And we're all trying to figure out the difference between the two. One is prideful, and one kind of has a healthy sense of self-awareness. I think what I learned, one of the big things that I learned was on that show was, even though I put together the money, even though I had put together some core elements of the team, even though I'd written the script, there were still levers of control that you just don't have as a director. In that, the struggle of, do we shoot this day for night? Do we shoot this night? What do we do with this location? What do we do with these things? It's like these are all things that are out of control. Like, I had no control over the fact that 3 days into production, my lead actor was fired from his TV show by the network, and suddenly we had paparazzi stalking us all through the show. And I had no control over sort of the stresses that my leading actor was facing as a result of that. Stresses that, I think we did a pretty good job of managing on our show, but like these things still happen. People say, okay, we're going to shoot 6-day weeks rather than 5-day weeks. I ceded a bit of control to that, and as a result, that became a really hard situation for our crew to be in. And so you realize like what you have control over and what you don't have control over. And one of the things that I learned on that show, that I knew that I learned on subsequent shows to be better on, was because you don't have control of everyone that you hire, because it's just, you're hiring people who are available, whatever it is. And so not everyone's there for the same reason. And if you're not able to lead as well relationally as you do positionally, it can be a struggle. And so I learned on that one, I can't take for granted the position that I have, because uh, if I'm not careful, people will start to second guess, or whatever it is. I mean, there's always people on the sets that are on set for different reasons, and it's your job to try to galvanize everybody. And so I learned a lot about some areas where I need to grow in terms of my leadership, my ability to effectively lead a crew, my effectiveness at managing my schedule, and then also, is this a 12-hour day or a 14-hour day? Those kinds of things. Is this 12 hours shooting, or is this 12 hours to taillights? And so I learned those things, and there were some things personally that I learned about myself in terms of how I manage stress, how I manage relationships with my core creatives that I had to get better at, and things that you have to do when you're a 29-year-old making your first film. And there were things that some of the folks on the set didn't know, like we had $100,000 investor flee the country halfway through the show, and my UPM is calling me saying, "Hey, we need 100 grand in 10 days, or we can't make payroll." And you're like, "Okay, great. And now what's our first shot of the day?" So there's a lot that you have to sort of balance. And fortunately, I had a good friend who was with me and had my back. But one of the things that Ralph Winter said, told us, because he was our executive producer on that project, one of the things he said was hire as well behind the camera as you do in front of the camera. You're right. You tend to, as a director, you tend to focus on what's my on-camera talent. And what I realized is, who's my DP? Who's my best boy? Who's my key grip? Who's my dolly grip? Who are those people around me that are going to make this thing go? And how can I be of service to them? And those are all things that I learned on that show. And I'm proud of the movie. I'm proud of what we made together. I'm proud of the fact that look, most independent films that start don't finish. Most independent films that finish never get seen. We got seen. We got released. We were on DVD. We streamed on Netflix. All that kind of stuff. Very grateful for that stuff. It was definitely trial by fire.
Yeah. No, I can only imagine. I can only imagine the phone call about the missing $100,000 and how that all went down.
That was super great. That was super not stressful at all.
No, you just played it off. All right, on to the next thing.
Well, because the thing is that, like, when you're shooting, especially when you're in a feature, it's like this engine, and it's got to go, and you got to keep moving, and you got to keep going. And if you stop, you create space for something else to happen. And so we just had to go, and so somehow we went.
Yeah, I want to touch on the themes as well of some of these projects, because I notice some commonalities between at least of these and your more recent film, What Remains, which is that you have an interest in murder mystery with the backdrop of faith. And I'm curious as to why you are drawn to marrying the two kind of themes, and being a Christian yourself, and how that informs some of what you write.
I think that's, you're not the first person to connect those dots for me, but you're certainly the latest. I think I'm interested in, and I don't think that if you take your faith seriously, right, I don't think you can get away from the sacramental nature of the spilling of blood, and why blood is spilled, and the notion of violence, and the sacramental nature of violence, and the ways in which the spilling of blood is both an atonement for violence, and also at the root cause of violence, right? And so I think I'm very interested in those things, kind of at a textural level. There's power in blood, right? Francis Ford Coppola has talked about this endlessly when it comes to Godfather and Apocalypse Now, and Bram Stoker's Dracula, and some of his work. So I think that I'm always interested sort of in that sacramental aspect of blood. But I think I'm also interested in talking about faith in a way that isn't meaningful people talking about how they're going to win the football game and give God the glory. I think I'm interested in the darkness in humanity and in the darkness in our souls or darkness within ourselves. What causes us, if you are if you are a good person or perceive yourself to be a good person, to go to that sort of nth degree. I'm very interested in genre as a filmmaker, and so and the movies of Hitchcock, Hitchcock films, that's what I grew up watching. So I'm very interested in that stuff, and I do think that there are certain genres that allow you to explore darkness, goodness, light, etc. And so for me, murder mysteries and sort of neo noir, which is kind of how I Southern Gothic type of things, which is how I tend to think about what remains, definitely applies to that. And I think that also, in addition to all that stuff, you know, who doesn't like a good who done it, or a why done it, or a how done it. And so I think that a lot of times filmmakers who are interested in faith tend to sort of you know tell sort of uncomplicated stories, and I like to tell stories that I would actually watch. It's funny because I just watched What Remains not that long ago. It's been a little while since I've looked at it, and I put it in because I went, I want to watch this movie. And I think that sometimes the reality is that as filmmakers, we make the movie we want to watch. When I made Least of These, I was very much interested and inspired by and a deep lover and appreciation of movies like Dead Poet Society and sort of Finding Forrester and movies about coming of age and inspirational teachers and all that kind of stuff. And with What Remains, I was very much interested in Southern Gothic movies like Hell or High Water, and so Taylor Sheridan stuff. And I kind of wanted to make a movie that sort of was in line with that, because that's what I wanted to watch.
Yeah, I saw you had mentioned on another podcast that you felt that the role of creatives is to ask uncomfortable questions.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the tell to a lot of maybe even the choice of genre for you. As I think at its core, and I don't mean to speak for you, but my sense is that with respect to some of these other faith-based films, there actually is a lot of alignment with yours, but I think you enjoy putting people in a place of discomfort to really make them connect more with it. And that's been one of the complaints that I've seen from people, particularly in sort of these niche film Twitter circles that I'm in, is that, well, a lot of these faith-based films, they're just like, they feel like a little pat on the back, and then you leave, and you're not really left with any self-examination. It just kind of it's open-ended, right? So
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Aaron. I think that one of the things that faith-based films don't always ask the audience to do is to reflect on themselves, and in particular to reflect on where their sanctification or where their transformation or where their own personal development may still need refining, right? Certainly with What Remains, we sort of have this character, we were very fortunate, right? Because we premiered at the Austin Film Festival, and one of the first reviews we got said, this is a movie about a character who's never completely convinced that he's doing the right thing. And I think that a lot of faith-based movies are about characters who sort of have a very sort of clear moral stance, and they don't always waver from it, and sometimes they might be tested in it, but they're supposed to stay true. That's not my life of faith. My life of faith is much more complicated and nuanced than that. I'm very rarely convinced that I'm doing the right thing. I'm always wondering, if should that have been said, should I have done that, whatever it is, and I'm very interested in that. So I'm very interested in sort of the questions rather than answers. I think you're absolutely right, but I think I'm also interested in, from a storytelling perspective, our own hypocrisy, maybe. Certainly The Least of These is a movie that is about hypocrisy and about a character who sort of reveals hypocrisy, but who's also a victim of his own sort of moral rightness, because he tried to do the right thing and it actually had unintended consequences. I'm very much interested in the idea of the unintended consequences. And with What Remains, we see a father who neglects his son out of grief because he doesn't know how to relate to his son. His son bottles up that resentment. It comes out in a horrible way, and then the father tries to overcorrect by doing something that actually makes things worse, not better. I'm very interested in the law of unintended consequences, and I think that stories about faith, you know, uniquely create the opportunity to do that. Right, a story like The Prodigal Son is a movie that just kind of keeps twisting and turning and unraveling, and I'm very interested in that, as opposed to stories that maybe tie things up in big red bow.
Yeah, no, and I was just reading. There's a book by Bishop Fulton Sheen.
Uh-huh.
It's called Peace of Soul, and
Hmm.
he really, in that book, he has a bone to pick with the modern, uh, I guess, pathologizing or explaining away the human condition, and reducing it to something, uh, like a mental illness or an environmental uh, factor, um, and just kind of showing that a lot of times, like, what pushes people away from the idea of being in faith is their unwillingness to look into their own culpability,
Sure.
when it comes to these moral questions. Um, do you ever worry that, like, you might alienate people in that process, when you're writing like one of these scripts?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, I mean, a lot of filmmakers of faith, and not even filmmakers of faith, but people venerate storytellers like Flannery O'Connor.
Mm.
And Flannery O'Connor, man, nobody in her books gets away clean, including people of faith. And and that means that Flannery is an acquired taste, and she is not a writer that everybody relates to. I certainly remember watching True Blood and going, um, oh, I don't, not True Blood. Yeah, the name of it escapes me now. But the Hazel Motes character, and just going, oh, that's strange. That's odd. That's unique. I don't know if I like that, because for sure all of us like entertainment, right? And I remember being in a room a couple of years ago with Chris McQuarrie, and Chris McQuarrie was talking about Mission Impossible Fallout, I guess, and somebody asked him what he thought about being an artist, and he literally pointed at the screen behind him and said, "This is not art." And I think all of us have to try to figure out, are we in the entertainment business or are we in the art business? Because the entertainment business is about sort of giving people that adrenaline rush, that like Top Gun Maverick experience or whatever it is. And I sure love those movies too. But I do think that as an artist, we are supposed to trouble people's sensibilities, not in a sort of like um egocentric way. In What Remains, I'm very much interested in my own hypocrisy. What Remains sort of came out of a family argument about when do we tell the truth about something and when do we overlook the truth for the sake of a relationship. And I still have not satisfactorily answered that question, but I knew that question was important to me. And because I don't particularly think of myself as particularly important, I thought, well, if I struggle with when do I tell the truth and when do I overlook the truth, surely other people ask the same question. And when do we cancel each other and when do we forgive each other? And that's very much what that movie is about. So I wasn't trying to make that film out of any kind of a lecturing thing. I do think that art is confession, and I do think that when you confess something, it's troubling, right? Some of my favorite films are confessions, and they weren't necessarily well received at the time by their audiences. Vertigo, I think, is a profound confession by Alfred Hitchcock. Citizen Kane, I think, was a confession by Orson Welles of his own hubris and his own tendency to self sabotage. Shawshank Redemption was not immediately accepted on its release. And I think that all those movies were deeply personal movies made by the filmmaker who wasn't trying to lecture the audience, but was trying to shine a light. Like my dad says, when the light of illumination comes on, there should be enough light for everybody. And for me, you can shrink back from that light sometimes as an audience. You can go, you know what? I much prefer to watch a movie like Independence Day or Top Gun or something. And there's certainly a place for that. But I think that, as artists, surely there is also a place for movies that run the risk of troubling an audience because we are asking troubling questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's something the art demands that we not shy away from. I think because I think, like, to your point, it seems that a part of the art is that vulnerability. It's putting
Right.
yourself um on trial in front of an audience, and it's really like you're revealing a lot more about yourself, as you say, than you are kind of trying to tell everyone that. Although I would argue maybe some films really, they want you to think the way that they do
For sure.
about things. Um, but yeah, there is a lot of risk that's associated with art as far back as art goes. You know, whether it was making a painting for a monarch that made them look not as good as they wanted to look, and there's kind of this dance where you're trying to tell the world something through your art, but you don't want to give away all of the tricks. You know, like there's sort of a subtlety to it, which I've always been very interested by. um
Well, Sidney Lumet, in his excellent book Making Movies, talks about how there's two types of filmmakers. There's a film director who wants to present a truth to an audience, and that's a completely reasonable approach. And he said, and then there's the filmmaker that wants to present the audience with a question. And I think that certainly, probably more in America or in Western art, we tend to gravitate more towards a propositional truth, and we tend to like movies that present us a propositional truth that we agree with. I agree with this movie, and therefore I like it, and therefore it is good. Whereas I think that a lot of times European filmmakers are more interested in sort of the question and the exploration, right? And I think that you've got to try to figure out, all of us as filmmakers have to try to figure out where we land in that spectrum. And
mhm.
and I think that you're absolutely right. What you said was really beautifully put, in the sense that, you know um, we are, as artists, telling on ourselves, and and there is value to that, and I think that's the point of connection. In film theory, there's this notion of the aesthetic distance. How far is the audience from the art? And the filmmaker's gift is the ability to bring the audience close to the art. And hopefully we can do that in the way as storytellers, where the audience, wherever the filmmaker is confessing or talking about, the audience goes, yeah, I've been wondering that too. Or, yeah, I relate to that. I connect to that in some way. And that's the beauty of art, I think, especially, the communal nature of art and filmmaking and storytelling, is when we can create those spaces where we go, you too. I think C.S. Lewis talks about that, right? Is intimacy, is when you share something with someone else and they go, I thought I was the only one.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
But I
I don't
think
know how you're doing on time, but I do have one last chunk we can get into.
I'm here to be of service. So
Okay,
whatever.
perfect. Yeah, I wasn't sure because I see what the time is, but I don't quite remember when we started. So if you have to do
Well, and then we
some.
had the false start and all that kind of stuff. So
Right. I actually deliberately set that up just to get you, prepped for this.
perfect.
But so let's sort of talk more broadly about the state of the union, like the situation in LA over the last few years. It's obviously been very tough for a lot of people. You've been closer to it than I have, certainly in the last few years. Um, what is your sense for the industry since we had a pandemic in the town, and we had, well, in the world, but as it relates to the town, and the subsequent union strikes as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think those two things were a double whammy, and then what you also have is sort of the reorganization of the world in a post-COVID, post-strike environment, where you've got this massive production slowdown as well, that is a result of streamer consolidation, right? So you kind of have three things that happened at the same time. One was COVID, which obviously did a number, and then the strikes. And then now you've got, everyone's kind of expecting that once the strikes would come back, once the strikes ended, production would come back. But the reality is that with the streamer consolidation, with studios sort of, being consolidated amongst each other, you've got that slowdown as well. And so it's definitely been a challenging time. And a lot of folks that I know, it's been hard. And it's been hard, I think, at a psychological sort of communal level. Now, what is interesting is, because I was talking about this with a friend a couple weeks ago, it's like, for the first time probably in a while, there isn't FOMO, in the sense that everyone else is getting it and I'm not, which I think, because people were talking about sort of in the run up to prior to COVID, people now are looking back going, oh man, everybody was working all the time. And writers are kind of looking at stuff and going, well, and the reality was that, well, Greg Berlanti was working a lot, and Shonda was working a lot, and you had some of these mega deals that were happening, but it didn't necessarily mean that everybody was working. But what you had was this perception that everybody was working. And so you had this perception of FOMO. But what was being hidden was the fact that a lot of the people who were working on these like 8 or 10 episode shows. So it wasn't like people were working like 22, 26 episodes, killing it. You were already having people who were, I'm like 3 weeks on this show, and then I'm 6 months between the next thing or whatever it is. So there was a lot of FOMO, I think, in the run up to COVID, that a lot of people felt. And then now what you're dealing with is no FOMO, because it feels like nobody's working. And so the thing that people are grappling with is what is sustainable and what isn't. And a lot of folks are working at places where they wouldn't have necessarily thought that they'd be working. And I think that is hard. But I do think that there is also an opportunity in that, if you can find a way. Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in one of his books. I forget which one. It might be David and Goliath. But he talks about, in an increasingly competitive environment, he uses this example of a basketball team. And he says that your average basketball team only really plays about 12 minutes of offense in a game. Out of an hour-long game, you're only going to play really 12 minutes of offense. And he talked about how he'd studied one particular university, I forget which, maybe University of Iowa. And they just had the attitude, we're just going to run an hour of offense. We're just going to be aggressive. And what they discovered was that they essentially sped up the pace of the game. And so I think that there is an opportunity, if you have the ability to speed up the pace of the game, to increase your value proposition, to create more opportunities for yourself, now is the time to do it. Because there is this kind of, everyone's kind of frozen. No one really knows what to do. And no one really knows what the studios are doing, and no one really knows what networks are doing, and no one really knows what stuff. And so it requires the ability to pivot. It requires the ability to pick up new skills. It requires the ability to find new opportunities, to kind of not be only in one lane, because it is so hard right now. And yet there are emerging technologies, there's emerging things, whatever it is. And it's like, are we able to learn and grow, or are we going to kind of wait for the old days to come back? Because they're not coming back. I mean, the reality is that, production right now is half what it was 5 years ago, 300 TV shows rather than 600. It's not going to go back to 600. Like, it's like people who are kind of waiting for like mortgage rates to drop back into the twos. That's not going to happen. So if you're waiting for then, that's going to be a hard thing. And Mark Duplass, I don't know if you've read his book, Like Brothers, which is an excellent book that I highly recommend independent filmmakers to read. He has a great chapter in there where he says, stop waiting for the cavalry to come. Start empowering yourself. And then you realize the cavalry is not coming because you're the cavalry. Practically speaking, what that has meant for me is, because I've written so much over the last 10 years, I'm now finding people who want to be a part of projects that I wrote 5, 6, 7 years ago that were just in a drawer. And now people are looking for that kind of stuff. Can you work with a lower budget? Can you work in a different capacity? Are you willing to? Are you able to? And that's that's where I'm seeing people who are finding opportunities, whether it's animation or whatever it is, because it is a strange time. It is for sure a strange time, and I think that there's a lot of people who are struggling um, with mental health and depression and things like that. And yet, like it says in World War Z, movement is life. And it's like whatever we can do
Mm.
to stay moving, keep moving, create opportunities. I mean, this is why like a year ago, Cress and I sort of formed our production company, was because he was an actor. He'd just come off of 4 years on Blacklight, and we had an amazing experience together making What Remains. And Cress just said, "Look, let's just create together." And Cress as an actor is used to waiting to be presented material. And because I'm a writer, producer, director, I was able to pitch him ideas. So literally, we have a pilot that I pitched him a month ago by text, and and then I came up with 70 story ideas that night. And then we got on the phone, we talked for about a week, and then I just wrote this pilot, and he loves it, and we're sending it off to his manager now or whatever. And it just came out of, hey, in a time where there's not as much work happening, let's just create. Let's just do something. Let's come up with something. Let's just flood the zone. To go back to the Gladwell thing with basketball, it's like let's flood the zone. Let's just go all in. Let's just try to create faster and have more stuff out there, um, to create opportunity, because for sure it's a wild time.
Yeah, you gotta embrace the chaos. And I mean, whether we're talking about AI, which has been a subject on here with past guests, or just new things that seem to just flip the industry on its head. I mean, it's not so different from other times in the past in LA, where you know a new th- there's a new big kid on the block, and there's going to be people that can adapt and they can work up that ladder, and then there's the people that fall off and they never get on that horse. I was going to close this by asking you about just some advice you would impart upon young filmmakers that are in that stage of figuring it out. What you would say to them? And I guess you already kind of gave me something to work with, but if you wouldn't mind elaborating a bit more on how do you go about working in an industry that seems to be changing by the year right now.
I mean, I think, and you know this as well as I do. Um, at the end of the day, your network defines your net worth, in the sense that who you're around and who's your posse, right? More than ever, it feels like you need a team around you, because you can't do it alone. And so I think that, one of my first big piece of advice to young filmmakers is don't come to LA alone. If you do come to LA alone, get plugged into genuine community as much as possible. Look, not everyone aligns with this in the same place from a faith perspective, but like Kate's and my saving grace, the first couple of years we were here was our church. It was a community of
Mm.
people. Now we were fortunate that we plugged into a church where it was a lot of young filmmakers, and so we kind of plugged into this like crew of people. We were just always shooting on each other's stuff, and you'd be directing one weekend, then you'd be ADing somebody else's thing, and then you'd be craft servicing someone else's thing. But that community, when you're 23, 24, 25, it makes a real difference in terms of having people who you're learning together with, you're growing together with, you're serving, you're learning how to be served. So that's one thing, is be ruthless about finding community, and about finding community that to whom you can serve. And
Mm.
and again, this is, from a faith perspective, there's some groups out there like the Hollywood Prayer Network and things like that that kind of help connect like-minded people of faith. But like plugging into what Film LA does, or what some of these sort of independent collectors are doing. But I think also, um, you know, one of the biggest challenges that I think young filmmakers struggle with is the creative discipline of actually just being disciplined creatively, especially if you are a writer. And I spent a lot of time talking to writers who struggle with being creatively disciplined. Now, fortunately, discipline is something that I was raised with. My parents, I was 9 and I was writing a short story. And I was really excited about this short story. And then I told my mom about the next short story I was going to write. I wanted to start writing that. And my mom said, "Have you finished the last short story?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Finish the last one before you start the next one." And I think that there is a value in this notion that amateurs start, professionals finish. And if you
Yeah.
want to be professional, learn to finish what you start. And I think that for a lot of young filmmakers coming to LA, it's learn those creative disciplines. But then also, I'll highlight somebody who both you and I know, Nick Alayo,
Mm.
who graduated around the same time you did, I think, maybe a year
Same class.
later.
Yeah.
Yeah, same class. And Nick came to LA, has been super faithful, has been super generative. I've been very fortunate to be connected to some of his stuff to try to help encourage him along or mentor him along with certain writing things. And this year he's kind of hit it with some commercials that have gone viral and have kind of exploded. And now he's got this great vertical web series that he's doing on Instagram called Eavesdropping.
I've
And they
seen
just
it. Yeah.
yeah, and they just passed like 10,000 subscribers or whatever it is. And but he's brought, like, it was funny because the actor in his thing, I remember from his senior thesis, and I messaged
Oh,
Nick and
really?
I said, "Yeah, Nick, isn't that the guy that was in your thesis?" He's like, "Yeah, you remember?" I was like, "Yeah, I remember because he's good." He's like, "Oh, he's become one of my best friends." And Lexi Lovateri, who was worked at production design on my film, has been working production design on his film. And Nick is, I think, a great example of somebody who's like, he's collected these people, he works with these people, he stays close to these people. And that's where, like, again, this power of community, of you need these people around you also, because if nothing else, you can all, like, I think it's way easier for it to be hard when you're with other people than when you're by yourself. And I think that when you are experiencing hardship together, you can find a way through. And so again, the power of community, to hold you in the hard times, and then the power of community to allow you to create together is really significant. So whenever young filmmakers ask me what they should do about, they're coming to LA, it's like, don't come alone. Come with other people. And if you can't come with other people, find those other people, because you will need them as you make your way in the business.
I think that's a perfect place to end this. Professor Scoggins, I'll still call you professor for as long as I know you. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure, man. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Hey guys, just a quick interruption from Aaron of Escape Velocity. If you like what you're seeing, just a reminder to go ahead and subscribe to this channel. We're trying to bring on more guests each month. If you like what you see, feel free to make a contribution to either the Patreon, where you'll get access to videos in advance before I put them out anywhere else, as well as our PayPal. All of the proceeds go back into the show. I'm not doing this for profit, but yeah, just appreciate you guys and have an excellent day.